All right, welcome to another episode of Family Tech Live. I'm super excited about today's guest. I've actually had his book for a while.
Good. That's good to see.
Yep, it's fantastic. If you have any questions about gaming, it's in this book. Like literally, and it's really sorry, I'm just gonna like toot your horn for a little bit.
You carry on. I'll listen. Yeah.
But yeah, like it's so like colorful and like engaging. It's not like it's not boring for sure. And you can like easily find, the other day I actually had to write a post about Roblox for Verizon, and I'm like, oh, let me see what he says about it. Like so super easy to navigate. Awesome book. So aside from being like the official author of how gaming in families and healthy gaming should work, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started and a little bit about your kids and stuff.
So yeah, I'm a father. I live in the UK. I've got 3 kids. I was trying to remember, we were talking before we started. So 19-year-old daughter, 17-year-old son, and a 14-year-old son. And so they're at the older age of things, but we've kind of obviously tracked through that whole process of having technology in the home. And as you could read in the book, it's kind of something I've wanted to engage with and take a step forward into. And so the book is kind of my journey with that. But alongside that, I'm a technology journalist. And so I started probably 15 years ago writing for a bunch of places actually. And the funny thing is that probably the most prestigious place I've written for is Wired, and that was my first gig. They had this
that's awesome.
geek dad set of bloggers at Wired, and I kind of got scooped up into that by this very generous editor, Kendra Mead. And I didn't quite realize what was happening. And it was kind of like lots of like, oh, would you review this? Would you review that? So some nice freebies, some really, you'd write something and people would read it. And so that got me started, and sort of I've just worked my way around a variety of different places. At the minute, probably the highest profile place is Forbes technology blog. I'm part of that, which is great. And I do some sort of like other journalist stuff, like broadcast and things. For if something happens in the video game space, then usually I'm called in, hopefully, to kind of be the voice of reason. And I kind of sit in the middle, because I've got a background in computer science, and so but a kind of an understanding of how families work. So I'm often advocating for, this is difficult in a family, and it doesn't just solve itself, but equally, the games can be okay if you get them right. They can be amazing, and so I'm kind of often all on both sides, kind of in the middle of this kind of argument, which is often happening, just people at each other, trying to sort of make some connections to actually say, well, what do we do while we're arguing about what's right and wrong? What do we do for the parents that are doing the parenting now? And that's what the book was really, is like wanting to create something that offered some things to do now while we're working out this new thing of video games and families and trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, and that's what I really love. Your YouTube channel is amazing as well. So there's a ton of videos on the YouTube channel. So definitely, I put a link to the YouTube channel in the description. So check that out. But yeah, with that, and I've seen you on podcasts and on TV and everywhere. So I'm really glad to have that voice of reason, because I'm a very tech positive person. This is a very tech positive space. I just want to help parents have the tools they need to manage it all. And that's what I really liked about your approach too. It's not, video games are not the enemy here or anything like that. It's it's very tech positive. So I really like that about your approach.
Good. Yes. Likewise, the stuff I've read of yours, I feel like we've definitely got this sort of synergy there of kind of trying to provide information so parents can make that kind of informed choice. I think a lot of people in this space are like, this is the right way to do it, this is the wrong way to do it. And actually every family is different, and parents know their kids better than we do, obviously. So they're the ones that have to deal with the consequences of the decision. So they need to, make that in an informed way.
Yeah, for sure. And if you have any questions for Andy or for me, definitely pop that in the comments. If you're watching this afterwards, not live, still go ahead and put those in the comments, and we can try and monitor that a little bit and answer those questions. So, so definitely let us know if you've got any. But I have some questions prepared for you, Andy. And so we're just talking about, tech positive. So what are some of the benefits of gaming?
Yeah, so I think a lot of in the past we used to kind of point to the quite hard skills of games as kind of a justification while to sort of alleviate our concerns. So it would be, oh, you'd get hand-eye coordination, or maybe you'd get sort of teamwork, or you'd be learning reading and those sorts of things, which I think some of that's true. But in the research I did for the book, actually, the studies show that there's not a great correlation between or causation of that learning actually then carrying on into kind of the rest of life. And the stuff that's more effective are kind of the softer skills. So kind of like learning how to socialize with other people, doing work around identity, and sort of trying out being a different character in a game, or being in situations where maybe you're not comfortable and you're working that out, particularly if you're doing that in a context with a parent or with a sibling or in a group. Then it's those kind of those things actually create benefits that kind of create this space where children can do the sort of stuff that it's just sort of stuff that happens whenever they play, but it creates another space for them to play. And particularly, obviously, if they can't meet in person, as was the case, and sometimes is the case still, that it perpetuates that. So that's usually what I focus on. It's these sort of softer skills. And what I like about that is because it means that kind of video games get to just be themselves. Kind of it's just experience them in the whole, that kind of then as a sort of collateral learning happens along with just the play. And so they're not being put to work to teach reading, put to work to teach math, which they can do, but it means you kind of miss the main benefit of video games as a new media, that it's really it's a new thing we're getting to grips with. So we've got movies, we've got books, and we've got games, and there's some overlap, but games do some things which are very unique. And I think that's where the biggest benefits are.
Yeah, those are great. Another one I would just add to that is like I feel like resilience.
Yeah.
They fail a level over and over and over again, and then at the end they finally beat the boss or the level, and they have that sense of accomplishment. But they experience those failures, and I think that's important too. So a lot of kids these days, like, we're afraid to let them fail, and this is a really easy way to let them fail. And then overcome.
Yeah, definitely. And particularly, I think as parents, it's easy to see a child play a game and get cross and think, oh, that game's bad for you, it's made you angry, rather than helping them process and interpret their behavior and say, well, what is happening? What was it about the end of that game that made you feel like that? How could you do differently next time? Let's give them space to reflect on it. So again, as part of the kind of the book and the work I do with families, is usually trying to help close that gap between the child's gaming activity and the presence of a parent, and kind of bring those two things together, which isn't easy in the home, particularly if you don't play games yourself. And they gravitate towards bedrooms and become a separate thing. But it's really beneficial, I think, to do some work to keep like the best gaming in the family space, and also to have this open conversation. And then things like that resilient stuff, then you can really be ambitious for that. And maybe your child is just successful at all the games they play. So as a parent, we're like, oh, actually, why don't we find something that's a bit more of a challenge? And we bring that ambition to them. And that's kind of an unusual process for a parent to say, there's this game I think you should play. And off the back of the book, you've got those suggestions, and I've created this database. And part of it is to try to help parents kind of become an expert in a really easy way without lots of time investment, so that they can then kind of lead their child in the way they do about books and films.
Right, exactly. So yeah, I love all those benefits. That's great. So we talked about the benefits, so we do have to kind of touch on the dangers, because everything's not all roses and glass houses.
Yeah.
So so what are kind of some of the dangers kids can encounter through gaming, and how do we kind of mitigate that?
So the dangers that get the headlines that are most worried about, the ones I talk in the book, are the things that parents are scared of, really, is the impact of violence, that a violent game will create violent behavior, that games can be addictive, that they are kind of designed to sort of trap a child to play more than they want, that they can be a route into gambling, so that your experience in a game, it might have a gambling-like behavior, and then maybe that's the road into then having an adult gambling problem. And then, of course, interactions with strangers, like the child is maybe having a conversation with someone who doesn't have their best interest at heart for any reason. So those are kind of the four kind of concerns, and they're they are real, and games can have negative impacts in there, but they're often kind of conflated. So, for example, the violent side, the studies we have say that there's a correlation between a child who plays violently in the playground and plays violent video games, and that's a correlation. So it's saying, oh, there's these children who do this also do this in the study, but
Sure.
that then gets reported in a headline: video games cause violent behaviour. And I see that kind of sent to me as a journalist to report on, and that's kind of the headline is set up as. And I see the same data, particularly over lockdown in the UK. There was an example that said, oh, there's a correlation between anxious people at the moment and listening to the radio. And the headline for that was, anxious Brits turn to the radio for relief during lockdown. So there was this increasing radio listening, and it correlated with anxiety, and it was seen as a positive thing that the radio was alleviating anxiety. Whereas on the video game side, the same correlation pattern is the games are causing violent behavior. And so it's important, I think, just to tease that apart so that we can kind of be informed about what the reality is. But at the same time, it's not to say that correlation is real, and it doesn't mean there's nothing to worry about. But it might mean that that's a positive thing for a child who has a violent tendency for whatever reason. If they've got a video game space where they can act that out, particularly if they've got a parent that then helps them reflect on that behavior, it could be a positive thing. And so there's a lot of kind of muddled thinking around what are and aren't the dangers. And that often results in sort of parents and children becoming separated over what they think about video games. So the children have one impression of games because they kind of have a good idea about what they're getting from them, and the parents have another impression of games, and often physically in the home the kids end up in the bedrooms and the parents don't see them, and so I think that is the bigger danger, that a child becomes separated from their parents and plays games on their own, which means that if something happens in the game that's unsettling, they're less likely to tell the parent because they'll be worried, oh, if I tell mum or dad, they might take the game away because they wouldn't understand. And that's the moment you want a situation where, if your child comes across something that's unsettling, they'll tell you and be like, oh, there's this weird thing like this. There's someone asked me like where I lived, or like they asked me, and that's the gold dust. That's the moment you want. And so the danger is if you just lock it down and just focus on complete safety, you can miss the fact that actually you're setting them up for just being very separate from you. So for me, that's actually the bigger danger than the headlines around sort of violence and addiction and those other things, because the percentage of those things are very small compared to the kind of the more broader, how do we parent children around video games?
Yeah, so that actually segues really great into my next question. In your book, you talk about parenting, not policing. So I think you kind of touched on that, but what do you mean by that? And explain that philosophy a little bit more. I loved the phrase, by the way.
Yeah, I think it's easy for us to miss this opportunity. Like video games are a really vibrant, important part of a child's life, and they're something that they're probably going to do for their whole life. And we can get into the habit of thinking, we don't like games, we're worried about them. And if we just resist them for a while, for long enough, eventually kids will grow out of them, they'll move on, we'll breathe a sigh of relief. And so what we end up doing is just trying to minimize the whole time. And so we're kind of policing them to keep them safe, or just to keep them within these sort of boundaries, rather than actually thinking, oh, my role isn't to minimize games, it's to try and help my child have a positive lifelong relationship with video games, in the same way that I want them to have a positive lifelong relationship to books or to films or to music or theatre, learning foreign languages, learning instruments, and all those things. It seems almost peculiar or strange to put that in the same category as having ambitions for how our child might relate to video games. But making that turn suddenly makes a lot of sense in the home, and kind of switches us and turns on a lot of the kind of parenting power that we've got. And it's difficult at first, but with a bit of effort, you can really turn around some of those conversations, so that rather than just being the one saying no, that you can't play that, you can be that person who's saying, oh, well, maybe you can't play this, you're not old enough, but actually there's another game you could play that would be much better, and maybe we play it together. Or there's a game like this. These games are all quite easy. Like I was just saying, why don't we try something a bit more difficult? Or you're playing just games that are about shooting or sport or something. Why don't we play something about fishing? Or so you can have that kind of same ambition for games in a similar way that you would for like learning an instrument or learning a foreign language. And I kind of like the jarring nature of that, because it sounds nonsense when you first hear it. But actually, in my experience, it's a really powerful bit of advice. And the parents who do that will come back to me and say, like, you know what? I feel like I've got my boys back. And it's really, it can be quite emotional. So I think it's a lovely thing to kind of help parents move through. But at the same time, it's not an easy, quick fix. It requires effort, and it's a long-term game. So I'm aware that it's easy just to say, just unplug the router, or take the power cord.
Right.
It's a short-term win.
Yeah. So speaking of that, we do have a question, but Megan will get that in just a little bit, because I want to touch on a couple things. But I'll bring it in when it's a little bit more relevant to what we're talking about. But I'm going to skip a question in my thing that I sent you. I'll touch on it again later as well. But because we've been talking about kind of addiction and like things in part of like the dangers. So everybody asks me about time limits, and they want me to tell them specific, like how long's
too long.
Right. So what are your time limits, and what do you recommend for families?
Yeah, that is what we run to as parents. It's like, well, how long's too long for a 6-year-old, or how long's too long for a 10-year-old? And I think the answer is that there's some common sense stuff, and you could easily pick numbers out of a hat, and some organizations do that. And it feels like they're helping, but actually I think again that they're kind of muddying the water by making parents feel like they've done their job by setting a limit, and it's an easy thing to do. So what I usually do is move the conversation to talk about sort of a varied diet. And like when we think about what a child's eating, we don't think about plate time. Like, how much plate time is too much plate time for a 6-year-old?
I love this.
We're like, well, what's on the plate? Like, it's fine for them to be eating a lot, but are they eating vegetables, and are they eating, if it's just sweets, we don't then say, okay, just eat sweets an hour a day and you'll be fine. We're like,
that you'll be great.
You need some vegetables. And also, and at the same time, that takes us into this territory of actually demonstrating this varied diet ourselves. And with vegetables, obviously, when the kids are young, we make very clear that we're eating our vegetables. And I don't know about you, but I think it's a common parent thing. You make yumming noises, like, oh, yum, 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 the broccoli's lovely, even if you don't like it, to kind of to really make clear that this is something that we understand. And so I think switching that thinking to like, well, what is my child doing? If they're just doing 4 hours a day of one thing, then that isn't great. They're probably quite bored of the whole thing anyway, and actually would welcome some variety. But rather than to say, well, what we're going to do is to slap a limit on it, to say, well, let's introduce some other things, maybe some stuff we do together, maybe some other sorts of activities, alongside saying what's those limits. And sometimes, particularly if it's got out of hand and they're playing a long time, then it's good to bring some limits in, to bring some structure, but to see that as a short-term kind of solution, and to do that with the child, to sort of sit down with them and say, look, you're playing 4 hours a day or whatever it is, but it means you're not getting outside, or you're missing out on this, or you're not, whatever it is that they're kind of missing out on. And usually, my experience, not every child, but most child, is relatively, put their hand up and be like, oh yeah, well, maybe 2 hours would be enough, or whatever. And then you can set up your system, as to then automatically limit it together. You can set that with them. So then it's not you as a parent coming in again and kind of policing them. But I think that's important. We see that as a short-term solution to get some breathing space, to then do the parenting of leading them into a varied diet, which kind of the industry itself doesn't do a super job of, because they kind of get funneled into the big games. And so again, this Taming Gaming database that goes along with the book and the back of the book itself is designed to help parents get brilliant games that kids will love, but the kind of unusually varied, the kind of varied diet, and also games you can play together.
Yeah. And my philosophy is exactly the same. Like, so when someone's like, how long? I'm like, well, I don't ever tell people a time, because it's different for every kid. It's different for every family. And, it's obviously different for the kinds of games you're playing as well. But what I do usually say is, like, I set a 1 hour time limit to begin with. And then I am very free with adding more time, but I like to have those natural breaks where they come upstairs and they're like, hey mom, can I have some more time? Oh, okay, well, did you get your chores done? Et cetera, et cetera. I can check in with them and
Mm.
then
Yeah.
grant more time. So overall for the day, I don't know, they may be playing like 8 hours in the summer or whatever, but I have those natural breaks and those natural check-ins where it's like, okay, I'll give you one more hour, and then they play for another hour, and then
Mhm.
check in again, and then play for another hour,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah, I like that. And it means that each of those times, it's a chance also to see what they're doing. Like, oh, why do you need more time? Did you not
Right,
finish
right.
that mission? Like, what are you doing next? How's it going? Who else you're playing
Exactly.
with?
Yeah.
And again, and those questions, they help you, they help the connection, but they also help the child kind of reflect on what they're doing. And sometimes it's like, oh
Right.
yeah, I'm just doing the same thing again and again. I didn't get anywhere. And actually it's quite frustrating. And then you're in a position to say, well, maybe like play something
Change it up.
different or do something
Yeah.
different. Don't just keep hammering your head against this one thing.
Right.
When kids, when they're younger, particularly, they don't have that same kind of cerebral development to kind of make
Right.
those connections. And so some of those questions can really help them learn to reflect.
Yeah. Like, I'm really stuck on this level. Like, can you come help me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'll give you some more time and let's go check
Yeah.
it out.
Let's look it up, look on YouTube, find how are
Right.
you supposed to
Find a
do
good
this?
tutorial.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Um, so we've talked about this a lot, actually. And so if you just have any other additional things you want to add, or if you feel like you've covered it well, but how can parents be more involved with their gamer kids?
So the through line of the book, and I don't know how clear it is, but the kind of the what I feel like I keep coming back to is, if you've got a child who loves video games, the most powerful thing you can do is to play games yourself. And most parents will think I mean play games with your child, which I wouldn't disparage, but I'm actually saying
Sure.
something a little bit more kind of awkward, which is kind of this reframing of games to say, well, they are for kids sometimes, but actually there's loads of games that adults play, and the kind of the average age of someone who plays games is kind of high 30s, and it's going up.
Sure.
And so if you can find a game that you
We're
as
the
an adult,
Nintendo generation. We've grown up with
yeah,
it.
exactly. So if you can find a game that you yourself want to play as a mature adult, so it's kind of either it's just fun, or maybe it's a game that's about an interesting topic, or it's an unusual way to engage with something, or it has a sense of connection or achievement or escapism. And if you want to do that, say in an evening rather than watching some Netflix, then it can, because obviously things compete for time. That think that means that then you become an insider in the gaming world. But I always say I know that sounds kind of nonsense, and I'm often stopped literally in the middle of saying that by someone, particularly in a school setting, who'll say, "I love what you're saying. I want to connect with my boys." It's often boys they're talking about. But can I just say, I'm never going to play a game because I don't like shooting things, and there's just too many buttons, and I'm really busy. And I'm like, oh, great, because this is where this conversation starts. Like, do you want to come on a
Right.
journey? And so the back of the
Yeah.
book and the database are designed to take people from never playing a game, never held a controller, to some experiences that that I think, and because I go through this process with lots of parents, will take them into, oh, I didn't realize games could do that. Like, there's a game about refugees,
Right.
a Syrian refugee, and you kind of help her get across to Europe in different ways that really can reframe what you think about topics, much like a documentary or something like that. And so you start to realize, oh, there's more to these games than kind of meets the eye, and then suddenly the conversation you have with your child is very different. And that's where that kind of quote often comes back from those parents, are saying, oh, I didn't realize it, but I felt like I was losing my kids to these games, and actually I've realized that now I'm bringing them back, and it wasn't as hard as I thought. So I think that's the kind of rocket fuel for it. And I know that it sounds really a bit odd and a bit impossible, like a category mistake, like why would an adult play a game? But my experience is taking some time to take that journey, and the games I suggest are like 10 minutes long, and very easy to play on your phone and very cheap. It's really powerful, and it can really kind of changes the conversation in the home, sort of diffuses it in lots of ways, particularly if you do that when your kids are a little bit younger, in the sort of 10, 12 years old sort of age or under.
Yeah, and especially, there's such a broad variety of games. If they're just saying, "Oh, I don't like shooting games." Okay, well, there's like, 50 other genres that you
Yeah.
can pick up on. For me, my husband's a big gamer, so we definitely have this, culture in our house as well. But for me, I am like games like Guitar Hero or like, you know, the band games or Beat Saber, I cannot do it. I don't
Yeah,
have the hand-eye coordination for it.
yeah,
Like as soon as it registers that I need to like press this button, it's like 10 seconds later and I'm like, "Oh,
yeah.
that,
It's
you
too
know,
slow. Yeah,
yeah, can't do it." But you know, my favorite games, I'm a big Disney fan, so I love Kingdom Hearts. I also love, you know, like snowboarding games. So like there's just such a variety that you can choose from. They don't have to be like, "Oh, well, I don't like video games because I don't like shooting games."
yeah.
Well, yeah.
And I don't have fast enough reflexes like you were saying. So there's one
Right.
game that's maybe worth mentioning some examples, but there's a game called Wilmot's Warehouse that I'm not sure if it's in the book or just in the database. And it's basically a game where you kind of work in a warehouse and you just are storing away the different items that come in your warehouse ready to sell them. So it's very, you can take it at your own pace, and each little box
Yeah.
has an icon on the top. And so you have to figure what those are so that you can put them in your warehouse where you're going to find them. And then some customers come into the top and you have this process of finding them what they want. And if you can play it with 2 players, and if you do that, you have to kind of coordinate between you. Okay, well, is this
Mhm.
icon a roller skate or is it transport? Like, should I put it in the toy section or should I put it in the wheel section? And is this hat a piece of clothing or should that go in winter? And so you end up with this
Yeah.
really interesting conversation where what you're actually doing with the other person is interpreting what these icons are, storing them in your warehouse ready so you can get them out quick enough to customers. And then the nice bit of that game is every 5 rounds you get free time, a stock check, and you can put everything in the right place, which I really like because you can get it all
Yeah.
absolutely organized. So that
Right.
the experience of playing that game isn't one that you would imagine really as a video game, but it very
Yeah.
much is a video game. But it offers loads of unusual benefits if you're playing with a child or with a partner, just that kind of sense of connection. And while you're playing it, it's almost like being on a car journey together. You have these
Mhm.
conversations which are not pressured, and lots of things will come. I play with my kids, lots of things come up along the way, and it's not like you're sat down and say, let's talk about your grades, or let's talk about that
Right.
friend that you don't like, or they're just like, oh yeah, you know, Jimmy's been a bit annoying again, and like, oh yeah, what's going on? And because you're looking at the screen, you have this
Right.
lovely space where you can talk. So finding those little gems that fit for your family takes a bit of time, but it's
Yeah.
really worth it. And again, that's what the database that goes with the book. You can do an extensive search and kind of whittle down to find the games that you might like.
Yeah. So that kind of just leads me into, what is your favorite game to play with your family? Would that be it? Or is there
That is a good
another one
one.
that you love?
I quite like kind of story games.
Oh,
So
sure.
and I've usually the pattern of my family is that sometimes we play together. There's a PlayStation game called That's You, which is you
Oh,
play on your
yeah.
smartphone, and it's like a kind of quiz game. And so you're all answering questions on your phone, but it's on the PlayStation, so you don't need a controller each, and you can play with 6 players. But you're kind of guessing what other people are going to answer. So it'll be like, who's the person who's most likely going to pay the check at dinner, or who's the person who's most likely to admit they farted, at the dinner
Yeah.
table. It's funny, kind of, toilet
Right.
humor for kids as well. And
Yeah.
you all kind of vote, and you're not trying to get what the right answer is. What you're trying to guess is who else is going to vote the same way. And so it's a real kind of
Right.
social game. So there's games
Yeah.
like that which we'll play together, but usually I've got one game that I have on the go with the different kids. And the Uncharted games, which are adventure games on the PlayStation, we've really
Yeah.
enjoyed. Microsoft Flight Simulator on the Xbox, we loved because when we're going on holiday, we'll load up the game before we go, and we'll fly a plane out to where we're going, and it's so
That's awesome.
detailed. You can kind
Yeah.
of, you can see things. But just having something on the go with the kids, I really like. And it always kind of makes me laugh because when I'm asked this question, the honest answer about what my favorite game is a really violent game called The Last of Us.
Oh my gosh, that's my husband's favorite game
There you
too.
go. Which is
Actually,
it's an awkward thing because if I should like something that's a lot more highbrow and not violent, but it's one of these things that actually, like many kind of Netflix series, that they appear to be this kind of brash, violent thing, but actually isn't about anything. But as you watch it, you realize, oh, that kind of violence is just a front for something else that is happening. And in this game, it's a kind of a very slow kind of study about this unfolding relationship between they're not actually father and daughter, but that's the kind of setup
right.
between an older man and this girl that he has to look after that's the age of his daughter.
Yeah.
And you just have like 18 hours for this relationship to slowly unfurl, and for them to slowly give in to the fact that they need each other and to soften to each other. And very different to a film, that happens while you're walking around, and like you half hear her say something, so you stop and like, oh, what was that? And then she says something else, and you can explore it at your own pace and that. But there is, in between that, there is a lot of shooting and kind of, it's a zombie kind of apocalyptic world. It's very beautifully realized. But so that's an example of a game that I really value as a piece of media, and that's why it's kind of stuck with me. And I've played it. My daughter, actually, she's got into it as well once she was old enough. But that was one of those back to front conversations where I was like, I think maybe you're old enough to play The Last of Us, and she was, oh, I'm not sure, Dad. I'm not sure I'm ready. Like, well, let's play a bit, and I'll be here. If it's too much, we'll just stop. And then she got into it and found out, had a real connection with the characters there, and has created lots of art about it. And it kind of, she's very creative in that way. So it was nice to see her take it on in her own way. So anyway, so I think
the side note of that is my sister went to prom in high school with the creator of Naughty Dog. So
wow.
My husband was in California for some reason, and he got to tour the Naughty Dog studios because
I'm jealous.
I know, because we've got that relationship with Evan, so he got to like see a bunch of stuff that they were working on and everything. And that was like best day ever for him, for sure.
Yeah. So I think these kind of games, as they become properly important, like the Lord of the Rings, or like these stories that we kind of keep with us, and they become kind of part of the fabric of your in-jokes as a family, or the stories you want to return to at Christmas. And I think letting them do that and embracing that means that the whole kind of thing about games just becomes this thing that's a very natural part of life. And then a lot of the kind of the worries go away, and it's more about, oh, what else could we play that would be really good, and like, what do you play after that, and maybe that inspires you to watch The Road, the film that's in a similar kind of style to that game. So it kind of, I guess, has this back and forth with different media. So, but I would still say, like, to respect the age ratings, and again on the site and in the book, we're very clear to say, here's the ESRB rating for The Last of Us, and when you read the examiner's report, it makes you flinch. It describes in detail why it's rated M for mature, 17 plus in the US, because it's a violent game. So I think taking that seriously is important, particularly if your child isn't going to play it when you're around. If you're playing it in the same place, they can process it, and you can gauge if they're uncomfortable with what's happening. But if they're playing it on their own and you don't even know it, they might not then say, oh, I saw this guy get shot in a game and it made me feel really unsafe. And they might not tell you that if you're not kind of with them. So the context, I think, is important too.
Yeah, super important. That actually segues really nicely into this question. So, at what age can kids start to game apart from those little Android games? Or better ask, until what age should we try to avoid gaming and probably video watching to kids?
Well, I was just on. So, I mean, I think it's like books and films, really. So it's different. It'll be different for every parent. But if you find the appropriate games, they can start very young, and they can have a really nice experience. And so on the site, we do offer guidance for games. I think I was just looking it up. I think we go down to, is it 3? 2? Yeah. And so these are kind of games where you move things around to do some cooking, or you like something like you play with a grown up, like Just Dance. So you're holding something, you're mimicking the adult playing it, or you're matching things, or you're just they're very toy-like. But the games we select on the website and in the book, they are proper games. We don't pick games that are kind of they're just like educational kind of pseudo games. These are kind of so that, which means that an older child will play it as well, and that's quite a nice thing, that children kind of keep these things with them and become a little bit sentimental about, in the same way that they remember the kids' programs they used to watch when they were young. You have a similar thing with games that some of these experiences there. But I think there is no rush, and I think it's fine to be slow about it. But one of the things I say in the book, that I'm not concerned with kind of persuading anyone to be an early adopter or to change their parenting style. I just want them to be able to make an informed choice. And so I'm really happy if someone says, I'm really cautious, so my kids aren't going to play until they're 6 or 7 or older, as long as they can understand, this is what their peers will be doing, and here's the experiences. So when they're ready, you can be there and sort of be with them in it. So so I think they can start very young, but you do need to find the right games and the games you can play together. One nice tip is that there's some games that let the child be the kind of assistant. We've got a list of games on the database that are kind of this expert novice pairing, and so one player is the main player and they're kind of moving things along, and then the second player is maybe pointing something at the screen and collecting stars, or is the floating character that's just helping out. And there's quite a few like that, and that works both ways. And actually, as the kids get older, it kind of flips. So then the parent, when they're 7, 8, 9, the kid is driving, and then the parent is the one that's just helping to be along for the ride. So it's quite funny how it kind of flips.
Yeah, one of my favorite games to play with my kids. Well, I'll back up. One of my favorite games to play with my family is the Jackbox games.
Yeah. So that's very much like the That's You game I was mentioning.
Right.
That, Jackbox is more varied, but that's a kind of similar camp.
Yeah, we've played That's You for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Jackbox games are so much fun. And I mean, even when we're in like a family reunion, we'll load up like one of the Jackbox games. Like my whole family was there, like cousins and, not my cousins, but my kids' cousins, and my siblings. And we were all playing like TKO on Jackbox, and everybody's just laughing and having a great time. So Jackbox is definitely my favorite. But my favorite game to play with just my son, he has an Oculus, and I like to play Acron. So you're basically like a squirrel and like trying to like, basically I'm battling him. I'm trying to like get my nuts to this like tree, and he's like trying to, prevent me from doing so.
Yeah, I think that I'm never that keen on VR games because they're quite isolating for a single player. But games like that, where you can have a group of other players, kind of trying to get the acorns in, and then the person with the goggles is then defending, and so it is much more of that kind of cooperative game. And so it's thinking about how many people have you got in your family, what technology have you already got. That's what I sort of say is you don't need to buy new tech to play games to begin with. And even when you do get started, buying the previous generation of hardware is absolutely fine. Those games are still great games. The industry likes to kind of drive us to the next new thing, and that's kind of something that gamers will do. Is like, what's new? What's new? They'll play a game, move on. Play a game, move on.
Yeah.
But last year's FIFA or last year's Madden is great. It's just got the old names in it. It doesn't change that much year on year. So.
Yeah, like the gameplay is pretty similar. They've just changed up like who the players are, because that's the players for this year. So.
And they'll say, they'll say, oh, it's completely different. There's a new mechanic about this and this, and you play it for 5 minutes. You're like, yeah, it's kind of the same, isn't it? Like, let's be honest.
So, so you kind of touched on this actually, and so I want to bring this up now. So which gaming system is right for different groups? So we have several different ones. You obviously have several different ones as well. But if somebody's saying, hey, I want to buy a gaming system for my family, where should we start? Or, what kind is right for us?
Yeah, so it kind of comes more down to what games you want to play rather than, classically we saw Nintendo were good for families and maybe PlayStation and Xbox were seen as older machines, but actually it depends what you want to play. So if you want to play Roblox, which is a popular game for younger kids, then that's only on the Xbox. If you want to play games with Mario in it, then really you need a Nintendo. And if you want to, then there's other games on PlayStation. If you want to play Ratchet and Clank game, for instance, then that would be on Nintendo. So the thing to do is to ask your kids, like, what are the games you wouldn't want to miss out on? If it was Animal Crossing, then there's that answers the question. If that's the game they've got to play, then the only place you can play it is on the Switch. If it's like FIFA, then you can kind of play it everywhere, but the Switch version won't be quite as good. It'll be like a legacy version. So it's probably PlayStation or Xbox. So it's more that than kind of, one system's good for a particular sort of player. And again, going for the previous generation is a really good way to go because you save a lot of money and you can buy secondhand games and they're really good. And like even say a PlayStation 3, if a relative has got that, it's a great way to start. And again, on the database, there's lots of recommendations for games on those older systems that are just these real gems that often are kind of often unheard of. So you can pick them up on Amazon secondhand really cheap because no one else has quite cottoned on to the fact that these are great for families.
Yeah. And that's a really good point about the older generation systems too. And sometimes there's games that like the newer generation just has a bit too much. Like, so for me, I really like SSX, the snowboarding game, but I like SSX Tricky and SSX 3. Like, when it got to like SSX 5, I'm like, okay, this is now too complicated for me,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So, like, going back to those previous generations might be even a little easier for somebody to grasp that's not, already entrenched in gaming.
Yeah. And then the other thing is just to think, like, what have their friends got? Because often if they're playing, it's not always so true now. You get cross-platform games, but to be
Right.
sure that they can team up with their friends on Xbox or PlayStation, if they've got the same console, it'd be much easier. Many
Yeah.
newer games you can play across different platforms, but still making a party and getting started is easier to be on the same platform. So that's
Yeah.
worth a consideration as well. But often there's a kind of a mixed. It's like, kids just end up with different, say in a class, they won't all be on the same system. Yeah, and also to think about what you want to play. So if there's a particular family game that you want, or you think will be good for a family, or do a bit of research and think, well, maybe there's some games I'll play when the kids are in bed. And if for instance you like what we were saying about The Last of Us and we didn't put you off of it, then that's a PlayStation game, so that would sway you in that direction. But again, if you like the sound of Flight Simulator, that's
Right.
an Xbox game. So it's a little bit of research. And again, the database is designed for parents who haven't played games to be kind of this safe space. There's no advertising, there's no kind of affiliate links, so that we can provide kind of that independent guidance quite quickly. So I think probably half an hour on there, and you'd have a pretty good idea of which way you want to go.
Yeah, for sure. And so that kind of segues into this next question. Where can we find ideas for games depending on age? For example, I have a 6.5-year-old girl. Find it hard to know which games are best and which will spark a better interest for her.
Yeah, so there's two ways you can go for age. You can search by the official age rating, which is a good starting point. So in the US, that would be so if you're 6.5, is it just one child 6.5? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you wanted to stick to the age ratings, I got E for everyone, which is kind of no age, and then the first one up is 10. And so at that age, you'd probably go under that, but maybe you'd look at some of the 10s and sort of think, well, why is it? If it depends what your sensitivities are as a family. Like a game might have a swear word in it, in a joke or something, and that would then push it to a 10. But equally, the rating will say, if it's got some violence, whatever. But also on the database, you could just pick an age, which is something I was just going to do then for a 6-year-old to see what we came up with.
Yeah.
So you just go to the search, you can say age of child 6, and then you maybe put a platform in. I don't think they said, but say you had a Switch. And then there are a lot of games that at that age you're probably playing with them, and then there's bits where they would play together, or they play on their own. So there's two games that I always call out. One is Go Vacation, which is on the old Wii, not the Wii U, but the first one. Although actually it would work on the Wii U because that's backward compatible. But it was also re-released on the Switch, and it's like an open world exploration game where you're exploring a resort, and there are lots of these kind of like mini games, sports games in it. And lots of people think, oh, it's just a collection of mini games, and it is that, but it's also this very open world that has people to meet and little missions to go on. It has like public transport and different ways to get around. So kids just love exploring, and you can play 4 players at one time in a split screen on one system. So if you've got a bunch of kids playing it, they'll come up with their own games. It's like the playground. They'll be like, okay, let's race down the mountain. I'll go on a horse. You can use a canoe, and Dad can take the train and that kind of stuff. So that's really nice. And then another one, which is on a wider group, so this is PlayStation 4 and Xbox as well as Switch, is a game called Chariot, where you're these 2 characters and you're transporting this little chariot through some dungeons, but you can only do it by pulling it with a rope, and so you have to work together. One of you have to pull it, and the other one has to anchor it somewhere else so you can swing over. And it's a sort of thing that on the early levels particularly, it's not too difficult, but it does require some collaboration and communication. So it's like, okay, we're gonna have to time it like 1 2 3 go, and then you both jump and pull it with you. So again, it's that kind of stuff which I'd usually recommend for kids. But at 6, they probably have got their own sort of tastes as well. There's a snowboarding game called Alto's Odyssey and Alto's Adventure, which is very simple, just one button tap, and you're just going down a mountain, and it's got a lovely kind of aesthetic to it, and really nice like characters that you slowly unlock. So there's these sort of suggestions you could go on forever, but I think those 3 would be a good place to start.
Yeah. And then like he was mentioning, I think too, so the ESRB website too, you can look up the age recommendation
Yeah,
for any
and
of
then
those
you
games.
get a little report as well. So you get the age, you get the kind of the descriptor. So it will say why it is this age, and it might be violence, it might be fear, it might be language, it might be drug use. But then you'll also often get a little sentence and paragraph of like, here's what the examiner noticed in the game, and it will just say, at one point, somebody lights up a cigarette and smokes it and appears to enjoy it, and so that's why it's got the drugs thing. And obviously,
Right.
the older rated games, it would describe the violence that is happening. So it's
Right.
not the sort of thing on those older games you wouldn't browse it with your child. You'd want to read it on your own,
Right.
but it gives you a really good insight into what it is without playing it. And if you pair that with watching some videos, again at that older age, you get a really good, quick understanding of what the game's like.
Yeah. Thanks. So we talked a lot about consoles. What about PC gaming? How is that
Mhm.
kind of different from console gaming? And
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on
Yes.
that?
So I think PC games are interesting moments. Like, so the first thing to say is the PC is a great way to play games. It can be very cost effective. It's really nice because you get a lot of indie games coming out first on PC. So these are indie means created by a small independent studio. So these are often kind of more unusual, more imaginative and creative in some ways because they've just been created with, just someone's kind of imagination, as well as kind of the bigger games that come out if you've got a powerful enough computer. So it's a really good option, particularly if you've got a PC already. You would need to check what the specs are of your machine. But the thing I think is important to say here is that because children watch streamers play games, and they've usually got an impressive box beside them that's full of lights and colors and looks very impressive, and seems to be the gateway into getting these games. And there's this culture of, oh, you make it yourself. You buy the box, you buy the motherboard, you buy the sound card and the graphics card, which is kind of, and there's some people say, oh, it's a great project. You can do it with your kids and they'll learn loads of stuff. But the problem is it is really quite difficult. And because you're buying components from different places, there's no one
Right.
shop to go to say, can you put this together? So if you've got someone in the family who's done it before, that's fine.
Right.
But if you're maybe a single parent or you haven't got much experience in that area, you can end up spending quite a lot of money and ending up with something which doesn't quite work like you thought it would. And I wrote something about this saying, actually, if that child just bought an Xbox, it would be half the price and there would be no stress.
Right.
But they've told their parents, no, the only way to do my thing is to buy a PC. And so the question is, well, what do you want to play? If it's like, oh, Minecraft and Fortnite, well, it's like, well, you could do that on an Xbox. It will actually look better and it will be literally half the price.
Yeah.
And then they will probably say, but I can do my homework on it as well. Well, it's like, well, get an Xbox and have a Chromebook for your homework, because then you've got separation between your workspace and your play space. So although I'm not, my son's got a PC and for some games it is better, but you need to come in with your eyes open. It's not an easy answer. But if you've got some knowledge and some perseverance. So when we bought a PC, he saved up for 6 months, got £1,000, did loads of like lawn mowing, neighbours things, because it was his thing he wanted. We ordered it, we got it. He was very careful, put it together, pressed the button, didn't work. Nothing, didn't even come on. And then you're onto forums being like, what's happening? Like, this doesn't start, that doesn't start. And literally some of the advice will be like, well, get a paper clip, fold it in two and put it into the power connector so you can short out the power. And if the disc spins, you know that it's on. And you're just like, I'm off into like this crazy inventor land. This wasn't what I intended. So then we were like, we'll practice the motherboard. We ordered another motherboard, sent that one back. We were still kind of out an extra £200 until we got the refund. Did it all again, didn't work. And then eventually we tried the CPU, did the same thing, and then it did work. But that took he had to have that patience of an extra month's waiting, and we had a temporary extra outlay of probably an extra £400, which eventually we then got back because of the return process. So that was my experience. And then actually when we came to put Windows on it, I was like, oh, how do we do this? And there was you can't create a Windows boot disk unless you've got a Windows PC already because of the size of the file. And I was like, this is impossible. We had to go to a friend's house and use their computer. And I'm like, this is not the easy experience that people have said, And so anyway, I've got a computer science degree. I'm a tech journalist, and that was that's my cautionary tale. Go in with your eyes open. He's now happy with it, and it's he gets a lot of value from it. But still, I just feel for the parents who are like, oh, I thought I was helping my son. I'm a single mum. We spent money and it just doesn't work, and I've got no one to go to sort it out. So That's my
Yeah.
PC story.
No, and I totally agree with that. I mean, I've been in IT for 20 years, so I've got that. So when my son, he is asking for components to put together a computer
Yeah,
for Christmas this year, and I'm okay with that because I know how to put a computer together. But I'm like, I can't even imagine for parents who aren't familiar with that world or anything, who've never put a computer together, best scenario would probably be to just purchase a PC that has the specs that you want.
yeah. And
Yeah.
and when you do that, that will be probably twice the price in terms of delivery, like horsepower for like because the consoles are
Yeah.
sold at a loss, particularly at the beginnings. That's just why they're
Right.
such a cost-effective way to get into it.
Yeah. And that's why you'll also rarely see a sale on consoles.
Yeah.
They're almost always the exact same price, like
Yeah.
year round.
Well, until the very kind of end of their life, it's usually well, I used to say 10-year cycle. It's becoming shortened, but usually the last year or two, they'll
Yeah.
bring out a smaller form factor that is then a little bit reduced. But even then, it's not a lot cheaper. But they hold their
Right.
value really well. And actually, after afterwards, they can actually end up going up because of rarity.
Well, and that actually brings up an important point too. When you are purchasing a console, there are usually two different versions. One is a digital version that is going to be cheaper, and one has the CD, like, you know, disc reader. So if you're going to buy the digital version, make sure you understand that you don't buy the discs, you only buy download games. So
Yeah, which means
look,
that the kind of main downside there is it cuts you off from the second-hand game market.
right,
So if you buy a digital code, it's kind of, again, you don't get so deep discounts because it's controlled digitally, but you can't lend that to anyone, and you can't then sell it. You can refund them. There's quite a relatively generous refund policy. So if you play it, you don't like it, you can then relinquish the code. The time period's different for different consoles, but
sure,
once after that's gone, you've spent the money. And so yeah, but it's hard to know. Yeah, I think that kind of argument is diminishing because everything is becoming just digital, and
right,
it's hard. And those kind of secondhand discs actually aren't that cheap anymore. The good games, actually, because they're
right,
quite old now, they go up in price.
right, because they're rarer. Yeah,
Yeah, so often a digital experience, and also it means you can't break or lose the disc if it's digital, and
right,
it's there on your account as long as you trust that. Like, so eventually those console manufacturers will turn off stores for older platforms. So like PlayStation
sure,
3 will soon be turned off. So if you bought games on the PlayStation 3, you just couldn't get them anymore, and you would have to
right.
rebuy them on the PlayStation 4. But it's now, that's probably like 15 years ago or something now. But still, if you had the disc, obviously you would still have that forever. So that is a consideration.
Yeah. So definitely something to think about as you're purchasing these things. So quick question for you. What is your favorite gaming system?
I do. It's funny because I like the Switch, but I probably spend more time on the consoles. And again, it
Yeah.
comes down to the games. I really like Flight Sim, so we have an Xbox to play that on. I like the Switch because of the portability. So I've just been on holiday, and so on the plane, I had the Switch with me and could play some
Right.
games, and it's very easy to play. Um, but those big kind of cinematic games, I do kind of gravitate towards the PlayStation because some of the ones I happen to be playing at the moment are exclusives like Horizon, Forbidden West, and The Last
Mhm.
of Us. Those games that I'll play kind of. Well, I used to say once the kids are in bed, but actually I go to bed before them now. So, but they're ones,
Same.
yeah,
Same.
they're ones that are some I consider as my games that I'll play. Yeah,
Right.
so yeah, I'm kind of one thing that's worth saying, I'm quite attached to the old 3DS.
Oh,
It's a
fun.
great system,
Yeah.
particularly the ones that were updated in the run, and you can get them quite
Yeah.
affordably.
Yeah.
The downside is they've got a year left of the eShop, and then you won't be able to buy any games on it
Oh, that's
digitally.
interesting to know.
You
Both of my
can't.
kids have them, but
Yeah. So if they've got a year if they've bought any games on the eShop, they need to download them before it gets turned off if they haven't got them downloaded.
yeah.
But you can still buy the cartridges. But it's a
Okay.
really kind of, it's in a nice period where people haven't started kind of collecting it, and so it's quite affordable. I picked up a whole bunch of the 2DS, so the ones that don't have a hinge, for
Right.
about £40 in the UK,
Oh, wow.
which is a bargain because the game like Animal Crossing and the games you can get on them are really good. Particularly there's a great starter system.
Yeah.
So I think that the 3DS is kind of a bit of an unsung hero as he could have moved on to the Switch. Um,
Right.
Yeah, and I'd say I'm naming everything, but also the Wii U is really good as well. Like a lot of people kind of saw it as a failure, but there's many games on the Wii U that you can't play anywhere else that use those
Right,
two
because you've got
screens.
that tablet thing.
Yeah. And unlike the Switch, where if you unplug it, it's just on the tablet and not on the TV, the Wii U will
Right.
use that. Will have, say, 5 players. One of them's on the tablet and is using their screen to go and hide, and the other
Right.
4 players are on the TV running around trying to find the person. And so
Right.
that kind of gameplay, particularly for younger kids, is really unique.
Yeah.
And again, you can get at the moment you can get a Wii U quite cheap, and you can also play games like Breath of the Wild at a much lesser price than going the Switch route. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's good information. I'm gonna touch on another couple questions we've got from Megan. This one, should we count as time gaming or watching videos if they only have it on for the sound, music, noise, and are not really paying attention to it, and are playing with something else? I was like, and actually, I understand what she's saying because my kids do this. Um, so my daughter really loves Splatoon and like just loves the music
yeah.
from Splatoon. And
Uh-huh.
so she'll just have the music from it playing. So I wouldn't count that as gaming or watching time for sure because it's,
Yeah.
you know, it's basically like listening to music. She just prefers video game music to any other kind of music.
Yeah, I think it's like that kind of varied diet, isn't it? These are different things. These are kind of different food types. Like, so an intense playing a game is one thing. Having a game on just for the music is a very different thing. Watching someone play a game, again, is very different. It's often about the person playing rather than about the game. I think, and then one thing you can end up, they could be watching TV and have a game open or vice versa, which is fine. I think one thing I do say is that and it's kind of, I guess, a bit anti-logical, but I want them to have some time where they're focusing on something and not just always be kind of cruising from one thing to the next. So actually, sometimes I'll say, why don't you stop watching the TV and just have an hour where you just play your game and just focus on it, and actually kind of enjoy that kind of getting lost in it and progressing, because you can end up just never actually settling on one thing. But I think it's just part of this kind of the parenting where we're just trying to help them curate a really varied diet. And the things the person's mentioned here, really, that's a really nice way to use technology, and kids do that. They'll use it in ways it maybe wasn't intended, and put it to use, and do things their own way, which is kind of what's lovely about it.
Yeah. Then she had just nice comment that this interview is awesome. Thank you. Gaming was the biggest part of me growing up, especially teenage years. Wanted to share that with my kids going forward, but I don't want to impair their development, as a lot of research say it's not good for them. So this is why you come to us, because
there really isn't a lot of research that says it's not good for them. The question is, well, if it's not good for them, can it be good for them the other way around? And that's kind of, there's not enough data. There are some correlations, but the picture that I see emerging is that actually kids are much more resilient and know their own mind much more than being persuaded or kind of impaired by this technology. There are a very small percentage who have got something, something sad happening in their life and challenging, and they'll use games to medicate. And that's a whole other thing, that actually you want to pay attention to that. You don't want to lock it down because that's a sign of something else you want to talk to them about. But that's a very small percentage. So I think we really don't need to worry about our kids breaking because we let them do something. They're actually pretty robust. And then if it is going off the rails, paying attention to the reasons, and actually that gives you an insight into, well, why is it happening and what else is going on? Is there something at school or friends and that you can get some real sort of gold dust information because you've noticed, you're playing a game. That's obviously the solution. Well, what's the problem that's making you play this all day? It's that kind of thinking.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So my last question is, do you think gaming is the social media of the future? Like, do you think it's gonna mesh together eventually?
I think for children, they wouldn't see a difference. I think it is kind of the same. So, and there's research in the UK, like a child's first interaction with someone they don't know will be in a video game. It won't be on social media, which is interesting. But I think the danger is that we kind of, in terms of our regulation and how we parent these things, we kind of lump them together, and they're quite different. Social media is an interactive thing, and there's lots of identity stuff wrapped up on it, and there's lots of news and facts and all that kind of stuff. But it is this kind of inert, it's not like a media in its own right. It's just displaying other media. Whereas games is this new way of making sense of the world and telling stories, and needs a different pair of hands to sort of look after it so that it's safe. And I think so, although they're kind of, so they're both social in the same way, but actually they're quite different things. And so that's why in the UK we've got some regulation coming about this kind of space. And the danger, I think, is that games get swept up in some of the regulation that just doesn't fit them, and then we kind of end up impairing this thing, which could be really helpful for kids, and it's actually, in some cases it's just what they need. So but that's a really good question. I think time will tell. I think as we get more data, we'll kind of see a picture emerge, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So is there anything else you wanted to talk about in this conversation? We've talked about a lot of things.
Yeah, I think that's good. Sometimes we talk a bit more about sort of games and addiction. And again, it's a similar kind of thing around sort of games and violence, that people will say that there's a study that gets misreported that people say, 3 to 4% of video game players are addicted. And because there's like billions of players, I mean, that's suddenly like 900,000 whatever players are addicted to games. Because, and often those are from organizations set up to care for those people, and so it's kind of a way for them to kind of expand their market really and sort of get funding. But the reality that we see in other reports is actually that number's much smaller. And I think that, and it kind of, when you just talk about adults, it's like, okay, well, let's get these numbers right. It's not a big deal either way in some ways. But when you're talking about children, if you're sort of saying, 3 to 4% of kids who play games are addicted, that's quite an unhelpful labeling in a number of ways. Firstly, you're labeling a behavior in a way that closes it down. And if, like we were saying just now, actually there's a problem in that child's life, and this is the signal, this is the solution that they come up with, and we need to pay attention to find out, what is the problem. Closing it down gets rid of that kind of resource for parents. But also then we're labeling them as being addicted. And if you read the WHO criteria for what video game addiction is, it's really high. It's that you're playing games to an excessive amount. That's having a detrimental effect on your life. So you're probably not getting to school or meal times, and probably not looking after your personal hygiene. But even then, that doesn't count. You then have to notice that's happening, and then be unable to change and continue to pursue games. And once that's continued to be pursued for up to 12 months, that's when it starts hitting this clinical criteria of game addiction. And so to say 3 to 4% people are addicted to games, we don't mean it in that clinical sense. We just mean 3 to 4% of people play too many games, but that's not addiction. And so I think that's really important for parents to hear, because they can end up using those stats to essentially win the argument about games. Like maybe they feel like they prefer the kids to read books, and so they can win the argument by this kind of erroneous data, and all they end up doing is just causing a separation between them and their kids. So it's similar to the other stuff we said, but I think that's kind of helpful just to bring in at the end there, just to kind of just make sense of some of those headlines around these kind of crazy numbers about how many are addicted to video games.
Right. So if you you're a parent, you're like, oh my gosh, my kid is addicted to video games, but they don't even come close to the criteria that you're saying. I can totally see that, and the thing that comes to mind, I'm not sure if you watch South Park at all, but there's a South Park episode where Cartman is like on World of Warcraft, and like that I can see, like that is video game addiction right there, where he's like not even like getting up to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of the extreme on that.
Yeah. And that's that, you get that as a headline, child soils themselves because they can't stop playing the game.
Right.
And along with that, 3 to 4% of game players are addicted. Yeah. And it's just this kind of, it's just muddies the waters, and it doesn't help parents. But I think I really feel for children in that scenario where they're kind of, it's kind of, there's an infringement happening because they're being labeled in a way that's really unhelpful. And there's often that most vulnerable child who has an issue, and games are the solution. And so they need an adult to come alongside them and say, wow, this is a really imaginative way that you're coping with whatever's happening. Yeah. But maybe we need to look at what's happening here. Like, what is it? And like, how can I come alongside you and help you with this? Maybe we should play some different games together, or, let's talk about what else is going on in your life, rather than like, look what that game's doing to you. You know, it's making you angry. You're not going to have it next week. And then of course the child is distraught because that was how they were coping
Right.
with the kind of, you know, with the scenario. I had this little story that I can shorten. That's like, you know, at the end of
Oh,
the
you're
day.
fine. I mean,
Okay.
there's no time limit on this.
Yeah.
Like,
So
I just,
yeah,
whenever
so
it's done, it's
I'll often
done.
say, you know, at the end of the day, adults usually come home and there's something that is like, oh, I've been looking forward all day to this. It might be a glass of red wine. It could be, you know, a nice meal or whatever. And if you're halfway through consuming whatever that is, and someone comes in and takes it away, like like a parent coming in and turning off a game machine,
Yeah.
you would rightly be, what are you doing? This is what that glass of red wine is what got me through this really difficult day. You don't know what my day's been like. It's been the day from hell, and I need that. And then the other person can then point at that red wine and say, "Oh, look at what that red wine's doing to you. Look at how it's making you behave. I think we need to limit how much wine. I'm going to take this away now, like, because it's obviously bad for you." And so you get this complete muddle of what's happening, and what you really would want is to someone to sort of say, "Oh, what was your day like? How was it so hard? And let's sit down and talk about it." You know, and it's so easy with those kind of headlines and that kind of perspective for, you know, a parent to end up quite understandably, out of concern, falling into that kind of parenting policing behaviour. And essentially missing out on this really great opportunity to kind of to hear what's happening in their child's life, which could be a crucial moment. You know, again, it'll be a small percentage, but it could be really important that we hear as parents, you know, oh, there's something happening here. Let's really pay attention to this. So yeah, so I think that's quite important to include.
Yeah, to conflate that reaction to like an addiction is, kind of overkill because, like you're saying, you can have that reaction without actually being addicted to the game. You know, be like, oh my gosh, I was looking forward to playing this all day long, and you're coming in and just like taking it away. Um, you know,
Yeah. And maybe they had an argument in
ridiculous.
the playground with a child, and so they're now playing a game, and maybe they're kind of repairing that relationship by playing the game with that child, and then so there's just all sorts of stuff, and yeah. So and the other little story around here is about stopping, because again that can be attention, getting a child to stop, but
Right.
again understanding that when they don't stop, they might be doing some quite nice etiquette work, like just the fact that they're not leaving. If they did leave, there may well be a penalty for their team, and also
Right.
they may just be wanting to say goodbye and round off with their friends. It's like, so if I'm on the phone
Yeah.
speaking to somebody, and if my wife's cooked, if she's like, oh, it's dinner time, she
Yeah.
doesn't expect me to drop the phone and come to the table. She knows that I'll round the conversation up, say goodbye, like, oh, let's talk again another time, put the phone down.
Right.
But for
Yeah.
kids, we can kind of expect them to just drop, you know, dinner's more important than the game, stop the game now,
Right.
come, you know. And
Right.
obviously there are some comments like they need to stop reasonably. They can't just keep playing, and they need to, something with my kids I'll do is to say, before you start another round, check
Yes.
in. How long's
Yep.
dinner? Oh, it's half an hour. Okay. How long are you game take? Well, 20 minutes. Yeah, okay, that's fine. And then if it does go longer, but we're in
Right.
a very different situation because we've talked about it. So,
Yeah.
but that kind of misunderstanding that if they don't stop immediately, they're being rude, can often
Yes.
be they're actually trying to be really polite, and they've just got like whacked for it. You know,
Right.
they've just got, you know, they've got some negativity for it, particularly if the parents come in and turn the console off. But it's
Yeah.
like that taking the red wine moment.
Right.
And then quite
Well,
rightly be like, what are you doing? You know, so those videos on, you know, YouTube of kids going irate because the parent, you know, turned the machine off, I can understand it. You could do the same thing of a child coming and taking the glass of whatever away.
right. Nope, sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Mom, you're not allowed that. You're addicted to that wine, you know, or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be. You can tell that I'm a red wine drinker, but
Oh, yeah,
whatever.
no, it's totally fine.
Yeah.
That reminds me too of, like, my daughter the other day, like, the internet gets cut off for my kids at 10 o'clock every night, and, she had, you know, forgotten that 10
Yeah.
o'clock was approaching, and she was in the middle of a game with other players, and she comes in, she's like, "Ah, I
I
got kicked
know.
out," and,
Yeah.
like, just, distraught because I'm like, "Well, you know when it's gonna cut off, so that's
Yeah.
on you,"
Yeah.
but but I can see that, like, if I just, like, shut down her internet, like, at any given time of the day,
Yeah.
and it gets kicked out of her level, yeah, her player could get penalized for that. She lets down her team, that's It's exactly
Yeah,
right. Like they're trying to be
exactly.
polite by, you know, gaming respectfully.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think just having that open conversation and sort of that the two-way thing, and a lot of this stems from if you play games yourself, your kids know that you do that. It's like they know if you eat or don't eat vegetables, they're never going to eat vegetables if you don't eat vegetables.
Right.
And if you play games and they know you do, they already know you're not just trying to win the argument. This is like
Yeah.
you're in the same team sort of thing. So
Yeah.
that's the thing which I think makes all this so much easier. But it's not. Whenever I say that, the starting on that journey is difficult. But once you get started with the right resources, it quickly turns around. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, anything else you want to add before we
That's it,
close
really.
up?
So there's a few links I could provide from the stuff we've talked about,
Would love
particularly
it.
like the age. We can pop those in the comments at some
Yep.
point, and that
Yeah,
would
I could
be.
even stick
Should I
those
do
in the
that? Do that
description.
now as we're rounding off? Like if I put them in the comments here. Oh, I can't
Yeah,
do
and then
it.
I'll go
Yeah.
ahead and add those to the description of
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
the
If I
video
send
anyway.
over the games by age, and there's a search page,
Yes.
so you can go in and put in what you want to look for. Yeah.
Yeah,
And there's
definitely
also
want to include
the
that.
first chapter of the book is free on the site as well, so you can go and have a read
Oh,
and
wonderful.
see if you want it. And
I mean, and I highly recommend. Well, and this is already in the description, but a link to purchase the book is already in the description
great.
because, like I said, it's an amazing, amazing book. If you have any questions about gaming, it's going to be found in here. So
Good. Yeah.
yeah,
It
you did a
took a while to
great
put that
job on it.
together. Thanks. So it's basically 3 years. And then we got to we got just about to launch it, and then the pandemic hit, and it's like,
Oh
oh, it's
no.
printing's delayed. And actually, that's why I created the database,
Yeah.
because it was delayed, and then it's turned into this bigger, actually kind of a bigger thing that's become my main thing I do now, is just maintain that, and got a couple of thousand games on it. And we've got board games, lots of board game suggestions, and like if your child loves some video games, here's some board games that they'll like as well, that you can find a sort of back and forth between the two. So yeah.
I have a whole closet full of board games as well. So
Yeah, that's usually the way. But yeah, then it's figuring out, if you haven't got that closet of board games, where do you start? If you know someone who plays board games, they can introduce you and take you into it. But so the site's designed, if you don't have someone in your kind of network to do that, it can get you started. And again, you can search by age and how long they take to learn and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So then, I mean, we're talking about gaming. So give me your top couple favorite board games to play with your family.
Yeah, I really like King Domino, which is a game where you lay domino tiles and you're trying to make connections with land, and by doing that you score points. So it's quite a simple kind of territory world building kind of game. But I also like this other game that's really simple but really clever. It's called The Mind. Is that one you come across?
Oh, no.
So it's weird because you describe it and it almost sounds like it's not a game. So it's just a deck of cards that's numbered 1 to 100. And you start in a group and you deal each person the card and you say, look at your card. You can't communicate at all with each other about what numbers you've got in any way, but you have to put them down in order with the one that's lowest first and then going up. And so in that first round, everyone's like, well, this is ridiculous. Like, this is impossible. This isn't a game. Like, what's going on, Andy? But almost, something, not always the first round, but quite quickly they realize if they've got like 1 to 10, they need to lay it quite quickly before someone else does. And then you start as a group to realize, oh, what this is about timing. And so I have to try and judge how someone would wait. If they had the card 36, would they wait longer than me? And you do repeated rounds. In the second round, you get 2 cards each. In the third round, you get 3 cards each. And so the idea is to try and get as far as you can as a group. But it means that you end up sitting in silence, trying to judge like how long you should wait. And if you don't wait long enough, everyone's like, oh, how come you did it so quick?
Right.
And all that kind of stuff. And if you get it right as a group, you can get extra lives and some special cards that help you as well. But it's kind of it's really nice, but it's nice in the family because it's actually quite a quiet game, and you can just sit there and if you get good at it, it's surprising. Like if you deal a group of say 5 people, 5 cards each, and they manage to get them in order without speaking, without communicating, it's just like magic. It's like, how did that just happen? And then you get the last card down and everyone will always cheer, because it just seems like this impossible task that you have just done, just because you were completely in tune with each other. And it relies on everybody, taking part.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that sounds fun.
Yeah. Yes, that's good. How
one of our
favorite.
Yeah,
you tell me what your favorites are.
Cover Your Assets. I'm not sure if you've heard of this game.
Yeah,
Yeah.
is that like a pun on? Yeah. So is it like? So what's it? What does that involve?
So you have some cards. I think you get 5, and if you have a pair, so like I have a pair of jewels. And so I have this pair of jewels and I put it down.
Hmm.
And then like and that's like nobody can take like your initial put down. Um but then like so the next person has a pair of like car, like so
Hmm.
he's got a set of cars. Um so if I want to take what's on your pile, like the top one on your pile, I have to have a car in
Ah,
my
yeah,
hand. And so I put this car down and I'm like, okay, I want your cars. And if they have another car in their hand, they can defend it with that car. And so
nice.
now this pile of cars is like 4 cards long, and so these little piles can grow as they like change hands and people defend and everything like that. And so whoever has the most value, so like each, the cars are worth like $25,000, and the jewels are worth $15,000 or whatever. So
Yeah.
then you add up how much money you have at the end, and whoever has
This
the
sounds
most
great, and
money
again, it's
wins.
one of those kind of. It's quite a simple premise, but I can already
Very
imagine
simple.
the sort of tactics, particularly in a
Yeah.
group. You don't put all your cards down at once, don't you? Like tempt someone in with some, and then you're like, "Oh, I've got another one," and then the other person's like, "I've still got another one."
Right, right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's cool. I like. Yeah,
Yeah.
so
So it's called
many families think that board games will be sort of second fiddle to video games, but actually they're really
yeah.
resurging, as I'm sure you know. And most kids who like video games, they will quickly warm to board games because it ticks that same kind of interesting mechanics, and the barrier and the ability kind of match each other. And yeah, so we actually play more board games than video games at the minute in my family.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right. Well, this has been
Yeah,
a wonderful conversation,
great.
Andy. It was so good to talk to you. I could listen to your British accent all day long.
That's very kind.
It's it just sounds like I can listen to somebody talk in a British accent forever.
The
And here's
problem is,
my
I sound like I know what I'm talking about, even if I don't know what I'm talking about.
you do. Like, so there I
Which
used
is
to
always
work at
good.
Disney World in Florida, and I would talk on the back of the tram, and I'm talking to this little, like, I don't know, she was like 6 years old, like this little 6-year-old girl on the back of the tram, and she has this great British accent, and I'm like, "Oh, where are you from?" She's like, "I'm from East Sussex." And I'm like, "She sounds like such a little adult, like she knows
Yeah, no
everything,
doubt.
and she's 6."
Yeah, it's a Harry Potter effect.
Right. So,
Yeah.
thank you so much for this
It's
conversation.
great. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's nice to have some time to go. Don't do this that often these days. So, and thanks for kind words about the book, and all the things you're saying as well. I feel like I've learned some stuff as well. The suggestions you brought were great too.
Yeah. So yeah, if you guys have any, we're gonna leave all those all those links in the description. So definitely check that out. And yeah, we will talk to you next week. So next week's live is gonna be all about toys. So that should be fun. So like tech toys, like STEM toys, things like that. So
Cool. Sounds good.
all right, we'll see you guys later. Thank you.